Hi, and welcome to this presentation on the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit, where I'll be walking you through two new resources that we just released. The first one is about what rules the market can make regarding speech, and the second one is about steps that farmers markets can take to comply with ADA during the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically related to mask policies. All right, so my name is Lilani Nelson. I'm the Associate Director at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems at Vermont Law School. And so at CAFS, we train law and policy students to develop real-world solutions for a more sustainable and just food system. And we educate students at Vermont Law School through a comprehensive array of residential and online courses, as well as through our Food and Agriculture Clinic. And we also develop legal tools and policy recommendations that have real-world implications for stakeholders all across the food system. And for this project, we've partnered with the Farmers Market Coalition, as well as NOFA Vermont, to develop the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit. And we have funding that supported the work on this project from USDA National Institute of Food and Agriculture, as well as USDA National Agricultural Library. Thank you so much to our partners and our funders. All right, so I'm going to just talk a little bit about the background on this project. So the Farmers Market Legal Toolkit website was launched in January 2018, and the three main sections of this toolkit were selected in response to some of the most popular reoccurring questions that we were getting from farmers market managers. So those were about how business structures would affect their organizations, what types of legal risks and how to manage them, and also how to make their products more available and accessible to all community members. And so you can see here we have those three main sections: pick a business structure, implement SNAP EBT, and manage your risks. And in addition, we have also been adding new resources to the resources section of the website based on new questions that have been emerging. Okay. So the first resource that I'm going to talk about is on what rules can markets make regarding speech. And we developed this research in response to questions from markets about how they might minimize some potential negative impacts of protests and political activities at their markets, and what restrictions they could place on certain activities without violating people's First Amendment rights. And your first question might be, well, what do we mean by speech? What's included there? So let's first define speech, and then we can go through the ways that a market can limit or restrict speech. So in the context of the First Amendment, speech includes actual speech, as well as conduct that the law treats as speech, such as soliciting, leafleting, or flag burning. So there are some rules that all markets could write that place limitations on speech without violating the First Amendment. For example, a market may have restrictions that are content neutral and restrict speech to a reasonable time, place, and manner. A market may also prohibit unprotected speech, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But a helpful rule of thumb is that you may regulate conduct, but generally not the subject matter or viewpoint of the speaker. So as I just mentioned, markets may have restrictions that are content neutral, which means that the market rule prohibits a particular expression in a way that does not depend on the topic or the content of that expression. So for example, a rule that says no signs permitted, or signs must be 24 by 36 inches. Those are content neutral rules because they don't depend on the sign's content. Markets should avoid content-based rules, which are rules that would prohibit expression related to some topics, but allow others. For example, if a rule said the display of offensive signs is prohibited, that would be a content-based rule. Whether you display a sign depends on the subject matter that it contains. So we would not recommend writing a rule like that. It's important to understand these distinctions because a court would treat the market rule differently if the rule is content-based. It's only possible to have content-based rule if the market can justify it with a compelling reason, which is a high burden to meet which is why we're recommending that markets should aim for content neutral rules. All markets can also write rules that restrict the time, place, and manner of speech activities. So most markets take place in places or areas that the law might categorize as traditional public forum. And a traditional public forum is an area that has traditionally been used for political speech, such as parks, streets, and sidewalks. And in a traditional public forum, a market may limit speech to a reasonable time, place, and manner. When speech activities interfere with the routine activities of the market, then it is allowable to place restrictions on the way the activity is being conducted, but again, not the speech's content. For example, a time restriction might be restricting speech when the market is setting up or closing down. And a place restriction might include limiting speech to a designated area of the market or creating a buffer zone where speakers may not interfere with customers entering or exiting the market. And a manner restriction, for example, could be restricting noise by simply prohibiting the use of megaphones. So all markets can also prohibit certain types of speech that is not protected by the First Amendment, which is called unprotected speech. And so here are the types of unprotected speech. Fighting words, which are words that by the mere utterance would invoke an immediate breach of the peace. True threats are speech that is intended to intimidate a reasonable person into fear or apprehension of bodily harm or death. Advocacy of unlawful action is the direction to incite imminent lawless action and the likelihood of listeners to follow the direction of the speaker. Obscenities is speech that has no social, artistic, or political value. And what is considered obscene can vary community to community, but it's something more extreme than just offensive speech. And speech that is illegal or misrepresentative is also not protected and may be prohibited from the market. And this includes advertisement of products or services that are not legal, such as illicit drugs. So as a recommended practice, we're saying that you should consult with a lawyer for further guidance as to whether certain speech falls into this unprotected category. If you have questions about that. And a general rule of thumb, we would say, is that the more restrictive that you're trying to be, the more important it is to get legal advice specific to your situation. All right, so here are some key takeaways for the market rules regarding speech section. Market rules should be specific enough so that a customer or vendor would understand what activities are not allowed at the market. They should also be focused on how, when, and where customers and vendors may participate in speech activities, rather than what they can say or what they cannot say. And they should also be reasonable in how, when, and where, in restricting how, when, and where speech may take place. For example, any market can write these rules. For example, content neutral rule would be no signs allowed. Or for time, place, and manner, you could say no megaphones allowed at the market, or speech activities are only allowed to happen in the designated speech areas, or speech activities are only allowed during market hours, not when the market is setting up or closing down. And you should know, just a note here, for the speech area, which is an example of a place restriction, this is allowed as long as it's reasonable. So if the speech area was somehow only 3 by 3 inches, that would be unreasonable. So you just have to think about that as you're writing your rules. So in addition to the types of rules I just talked through, there are some rules that some markets may write that are more restrictive. And there are 2 instances that I'm going to talk about when a market may write more restrictive rules. The first instance is that any market occurring on property considered a non-public forum under the law may write content-based rules, but not viewpoint-based rules. And I'll go into that in just a bit. Also, markets in non-public forums have a broader discretion in the regulation of speech generally. And the second instance is that a private market may write rules, any rules restricting speech, as long as they're not entangled with a government entity or serving a public function. So what is a non-public forum? A non-public forum is public property that has historically not been designated as a place for political speech. For example, schools, jails, airports, and military bases are non-public forums. Some factors to consider when determining whether a space is a non-public forum are whether it is a place for free expression, whether speech interferes with what the location is used for, and whether speech is the purpose, free speech is the purpose of the location. And unlike traditional public forums, non-public forums may have content-based rules. So that's restricting speech on an entire topic, but not viewpoint-based rules, which would be restricting speech on one or more particular viewpoints or opinions on a topic. So for example, a content-based rule might restrict speech on the topic of abortions, but a viewpoint-based rule might restrict any speech specifically against abortions. And viewpoint-based rules are just not allowed. A farmer's market manager should consult a lawyer for further guidance on whether their setting may be a traditional public forum or a non-public forum. All right, so the second instance when markets may write rules that are more restrictive is if they are a private market when they're not entangled with a government entity or serving a public function. And you should note that state law may impose additional obligations on private markets. In terms of how to know if your market is privately or publicly operated, so if a government entity runs the market, it is publicly operated. And if a private business or organization runs the market, it is privately operated. In terms of what it means to be entangled, this may happen when the government affirmatively authorizes, encourages, or facilitates privately operated market activities. And if it's unclear which category your market falls under, you should just follow the stricter set of requirements, which are those for publicly operated markets, just to err on the side of caution. So at the end of the resource that I've just been telling you about, you will see there are two decision trees. There's lots going on the slide here, but if you go to the resource, each of these are a single page, and you can go through those on your own. I'm not going to go through it right now. Just remember, the more restrictive you're trying to be, the more important it is to get legal advice specific to your situation. Hopefully, this information in the resource and these decision trees can be helpful for you and make it clear what types of rules your markets can make to limit speech activities at your market. All right, so we're going to move on to the second resource. This one is called Face Mask Requirements and the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. What should farmers markets do to comply with ADA during the COVID-19 pandemic? We've heard from a lot of markets over the past year asking what they can and can't do regarding requiring and enforcing face mask requirements and how to make sure that they are complying with ADA. So in response to those questions, we've developed this resource. So it's widely understood, and it is best public health practice to wear masks, and it's clear that wearing masks reduces transmission of COVID-19. However, some people may not be able to wear masks due to a disability, and there's also people who may not want to wear a mask. So this resource explains how markets can protect themselves from legal risks by establishing mask policies, preparing and determining their ability to provide reasonable modifications, and keeping thorough records. Markets can create their own mask policy to require anyone entering the market to wear a mask. You might be wondering, but how does my state or local mask mandate affect my ability to create a mask policy in my market? So regardless of whether your municipality has a mask mandate or not, you should be able to create a mask policy for your market. And if you're a publicly operated market, then you may have a different process that you should follow for creating a mask policy. And we're recommending that you consult with your municipality's legal department for guidance on that. Most states have a form of a mask policy in place, or have at some point over the past year. Some states that have mask mandates also have issued some specific guidance for farmers markets during COVID-19. And you can find these guidance documents on the State Department of Ag's website usually, or from your State Farmers Markets Association's website. And guidance may include required practices such as customer face coverings, limited occupancy, social distancing, and customer flow, and also restrictions on self-serve stations. And we're referencing in the resource one example from the state of Vermont. So you can check that out, linked from our resource. And even if your state does not have a farmers market specific guidance or does not have a statewide mask policy, privately operated farmers markets can establish their own mask policy. In terms of how a market can implement the mask policy, we recommend farmers markets follow these steps. First, you should update your vendor. You should make sure to update your vendor agreements to ensure that vendors will also comply with the mask policy. You also need to communicate the mask policy on your website, social media platforms, and at the entrance of the market using signage. We also would recommend having masks available in case somebody does want to enter the market but doesn't have their own mask. You should also talk to local public health and safety officials in advance about how to best enforce mask requirements and how to do so safely and equitably. And also ensure that all market personnel and volunteers receive training on the mask policy and how and when to enforce it, including what they should do if somebody asks to enter without a mask or requests an accommodation, which I'm going to get into more detail in just a moment. We've heard a lot of questions also about involving local safety officials in enforcing mask policies, where some markets have reported intimidation or threats of violence from customers who don't want to comply with a face mask policy. And they're worried that they may be responsible for enforcing the state law. So market staff and volunteers do not need to act as law enforcement. And if someone is causing an unsafe situation, you should call the police. But with that being said, given what is known about the realities and impacts of inequitable policing in our country, we also think markets should make sure to provide staff and volunteers with education and training to make sure that the decision to call the police isn't made as a result of implicit bias. Now I'm going to talk about how to apply the ADA rules to mask policies. So it may be that a market's policy requiring everyone who shops at the market to wear a mask might conflict with the ADA's protections for someone who can't wear a mask due to a disability. This doesn't mean that the market has to let somebody into the market without a mask just because they can't wear it, but it does mean that a market must be prepared to offer a modification to that customer who wants to shop at the market. Reasonable modifications to the in-person shopping experience can enable customers who can't wear a mask to access the same goods and services that any other customer would be shopping for. Title III of the ADA applies to places of public accommodation like farmers markets, which means there are rules about how farmers markets should conduct business so as to not discriminate against individuals with a disability. In particular, it is unlawful to ask about a customer's medical condition or ask for any personal medical information, including asking for proof of disability. It is the responsibility of the person who is seeking the modification to acknowledge their disability and communicate the request. If the person does not proactively assert that they have a disability under the ADA, market personnel can ask if the customer is exempt from wearing a mask, either because they meet exceptions defined by the state or local government, or maybe they are not recommended to do so in accordance to CDC guidelines. And if the individual acknowledges the disability, and again, the market may not ask the person for any specific medical information or proof, this is merely just a yes or no question, then the market must identify what reasonable modifications they can provide for a customer who requests the accommodation. So reasonable modifications are exactly what they sound like. They should be simple, cost-effective changes a business can make to promote equal participation in its services among its customer base. For a farmer's market, this means a person with a disability would be able to access the same goods and services available at the market using the modification. A reasonable modification should be feasible, meaning the market can adapt its system to aid a person with a disability without expending an extreme amount of time or money. So if the market can't readily achieve the modification, it's the same as denying the person the service. Therefore, we're recommending markets conduct an assessment of what the market could do to serve people with a disability and list the reasons why modification is feasible or is not feasible. And our resource provides a template at the end that markets can use to help you conduct this assessment. So there are several things a market can do to reasonably modify the shopping experience for someone who can't wear a mask due to a disability. Here are some examples right now on the slide. You could set up an online pre-order and curbside pickup system. You could have a market volunteer shop for the customer and pre-box goods for curbside pickup. Also designate a time frame for vulnerable customers to shop. A decrease in the volume of shoppers may allow markets to accommodate those who cannot wear a mask. And there may be other creative ideas that you or others have that would best suit the needs of your market and your vendors. I encourage you to be creative and think about how you can do this to fit the needs of your own market. So if a person approaches you at the market without a mask, we're recommending you ask them if they are able to wear a mask, and if the answer is no, then you show the list of exemptions and ask the person to confirm they are exempt from wearing a mask. And if they are exempt from wearing a mask, then you offer a reasonable modification. And after that, you should make sure to record the request and the response in the ADA log. And we provide a template in this resource as well for you to do this easily. And also, here are some recommended steps for accommodating people with a disability. So as I mentioned before, it's important to make an assessment of your own market's ability to provide reasonable modifications to people who can't wear a mask due to their disability. Also, keep a record or log for writing down requests for modifications and reasons why the market was or was not able to meet the request. And again, there's a template for this as part of this resource. Also, contact local public health and safety officials to better understand state and local requirements and enforcement mechanisms. And lastly, we recommend you also reach out to the regional ADA office for additional support on navigating the requirements of state mask mandates in the ADA, if you have any more questions. And also, lastly, ensure that all market volunteers and personnel receive training on the ADA requirements and how to accommodate people with disabilities. All right, so you might be wondering, are there any exceptions to this? Are there any situations where you don't need to provide reasonable modifications? And there are only two situations where a market might be exempt from providing a proposed modification. One is direct threat, and the other is fundamental alteration. And I'll go through direct threat first. So for direct threat, if the person with a disability poses a significant risk to the health and safety of others, and a modification cannot eliminate this risk, then that modification may fall under the direct threat exception. The market must determine first whether the risk to the health and safety of others is significant. And if the market concludes that the risk is significant, then the business does not have to provide access to the service with the proposed modification. Note that this is not the same as denying a person with a disability access to the business service. So if there's another reasonable modification that exists, then the business still must offer the alternative modification. For example, if a person is unable to wear a mask inside the market and requested a modification to the mask policy so they could shop inside the market without a mask, the market would just have to assess the risk and see whether that risk is significant. Farmers markets must rely on objective source of evidence to make this determination. And in the case of COVID-19 pandemic, courts would likely uphold a market's decision to not modify their mask policy to let someone shop in the market without a mask because of the high chance of transmitting COVID-19, even if the person does not have symptoms of the illness. The direct threat exception does not let markets deny service to a person who can't wear a mask. Markets still must take care to offer other reasonable modifications to accommodate the person with a disability. So fundamental alteration. The fundamental alteration exception applies when the nature of the market's service would change due to how much labor or time is required to ensure equal access for all customers by offering a particular modification. This determination is specific to each market. Since a farmer's market is in the business of selling food, a reasonable modification may accomplish this goal without too much hassle. For example, it may be feasible for a larger and more established market to have a pre-ordering system with curbside pickup or personal shopper to accommodate people with a disability. But for a market with only a few personnel, limited time available, and a smaller operating budget, those same modifications might just not be feasible due to extra costs and the administrative burden that would be required. So in that latter case, the market should document the reasons why the modification would be unreasonable and would fundamentally change the nature of the business. All right, so as part of this resource, we've included 2 useful tools or templates that I've mentioned already. One is the ADA compliance checklist, which is a form you can use to document the reasonable modifications that your market can provide. And you can note, there's space on there to note whether any would result in direct threat or fundamental alteration. And with examples included for you to start with. And the second tool is the market log for ADA requests for reasonable modifications. And we're recommending that you use this to document all of the requests you receive for reasonable modifications and scan them and add them to your market records. All right, so in conclusion, it's most important to remember when someone approaches you at the market without a mask to not ask for proof of disability or for any information regarding a medical condition. You can ask them if they're able to wear a mask, and if they say no, then you should show them the list of exemptions and ask them to confirm that they are exempt from wearing a mask. Then if they are exempt, you should offer reasonable modification and record the request and the response in the ADA log. So hopefully that's clear. And that's all. Thank you for listening to this presentation. Hopefully it was helpful, and please reach out if you have any questions. We have a contact form on our website, so you can contact us there. All right, thank you.